In the 1950s, we saw the dawn of rock music, and in the 60s, they perfected the rock pop song, and later in the decade, musicians started to push the envelope sonically. But with the 70s, something new started to happen. Bands striving for new sounds, new frontiers, in some cases, perfection. New genres were launched, and labels became the new vogue for musical artists. Glam rock, prog rock, art rock, punk rock, hard rock. Record companies just loved putting bands into little boxes so that they could market them. But one man refused to be marginalized. His bands, Bebop Deluxe and Red Noise, were notoriously hard to put into one of those boxes. The music was complicated, yet at the same time, catchy. He crossed multiple genres at the same time, and when record companies tried to force him into a corner, he walked away from it all. The extremely interesting and fiercely independent Bill Nelson is our subject, next on Forgotten Fretmasters. Hello all, and welcome to the Guitar Historian channel, where we examine all things classic rock and blues with a focus on the stories that are a little less well known. If that sounds good to you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and check the other episodes of this, our flagship series called Forgotten Fretmasters, where we examine guitarists or musicians who for one reason or another might not have been as commercially successful as, had the longevity of, or left us sooner than some of the other guys who often end up on all the top 10 lists. Today we're looking at a guitarist who's best known for his work with the notoriously hard to categorize bands Bebop Deluxe and Red Noise back in the 1970s. But Bill is still very active today as a musician and a producer, and is still notoriously hard to categorize, and that's fine by him. William Nelson was born on 18 December 1948 in Wakefield, West Riding of Yorkshire, England, to Jean and Walter Nelson. Nelson came from yet another musical family, with his father Walter playing alto sax in his own dance band, and his mother singing and dancing in a troupe when she was younger. Although his father was very supportive of Bill buying him his first acoustic guitar, he was disappointed in his not pursuing the learning of music theory, disparagingly calling those who couldn't read music as buskers. But Bill did learn from ear, and his first guitar hero was Duane Eddy, much like our first Forgotten Fretmaster, Mick Ronson. He was struck particularly by Eddy's hit Because They're Young and fell in love with the sound of his guitar. As a teenager, he would enter the Wakefield College of Art, developing an admiration of multifaceted and complicated French poet named Jean Cocteau, whose ability to create artwork within multiple art forms would drive Nelson's inspiration for many years. For some reason, Bill got a fairly late start to the music game, with his father buying him a Gibson ES-345, which he still owns, but not until late into his teen years. Nelson has used an insane number of guitars over the years, with touchstones being the 345, as well as a Hoyer Les Paul copy that Nelson was photographed in 1972 with, that he would subsequently sell, and then become reunited again later in 2016. He would also start a partnership with Eastwood Guitars, helping design many futuristic-looking models for the outfit. He's also been known to play a custom shop Gibson Les Paul Custom, and a custom shop Fender 59 Stratocaster, and a Gretsch White Falcon, which goes back to his early days as well. And the list of amps and pedals and effects would have us here all day. But Nelson would kick around a number of bands in the late 60s. His first known recording work was with a band called Global Village, who would cut 3 cover songs for an EP, but they would disband in 1968. Shortly after this, Bill would marry his first wife Shirley and become a Pentecostal Christian, recording with a label called Holy Ground Records, which basically made Christian music. Today, Nelson is somewhat dismissive of the recordings, but as these were an early foray into recorded music for Nelson, the market demanded that they be re-released in 2001 under the name Electrotype. The next year, Nelson would have a large contribution to the band Light Years Away on their album Astral Navigations. On the track Yesterday, not a cover of the Beatles song, Nelson's guitar was recorded in a heavily fuzzed out acid rock style, and the track would give him his first exposure to legendary British DJ John Peel, who would play the track on his show and take a liking to Nelson's guitar work in particular. Shortly after, in 1970, Bill would record his first solo album called Northern Dream, and Peel liked the album so much that Nelson said he played the entire album on his radio show. Northern Dream is a nice little sheep in wolf's clothing, an esoteric gem by Nelson, showcasing his progressive sound and recording techniques while clothed in pop sensibilities. It seemed to feature every single one of Nelson's influences all at once, which would be a harbinger of his career in totality. The exposure by Peel and subsequent live shows by Nelson would garner the attention of a subsidiary of England's largest record label, EMI. Their subsidiary, Harvest Records, would offer Nelson a solo recording contract with an eye on re-recording Northern Dream in a proper studio, but Nelson, even then, didn't want to rest on his laurels or repeat anything that he'd done before. He had just assembled the first version of the band that would go on to define his 70s career, Bebop Deluxe. Nelson said he'd repeatedly turned down EMI's offers of a solo contract and said that if they wanted him that bad, they would have to sign the band instead. Eventually, Harvest Records would relent and signed Bebop Deluxe to a deal in 1973. The founding lineup consisted of Nelson, guitarist Ian Parkin, bassist and vocalist Robert Bryan, drummer Nicholas Chatterton Dew, and keyboardist Richard Brown. The band's first album would be released in June of 1974 and was called Axe Victim. Unlike Nelson's later work, the album was definitely influenced by the exploding glam rock genre that was ruling England at the time. As a result, Nelson got his first taste of the musical publications pigeonholing him. He was immediately compared to David Bowie, and the fact that Bebop Deluxe had flirted with the use of makeup and androgynous outfits in the early days didn't help either. The album and period in Deluxe's history was different, especially in that this founding version would only last for this one album and tour, as both Nelson and the record label were somewhat disappointed by the musical contributions of the other members, and Nelson decided to disband Bebop Deluxe completely and rebuild it from the ground up over the course of the next few months. There were a few hiccups in the next year as Nelson tried to get the right mixture of alchemy to record the band's second effort. Bassist Paul Jeffries, keyboardist Milton Reams James, and drummer Simon Fox would join the band for a short time before Jeffries and Reams James would depart. Jeffries would actually go on to pass away in the infamous bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. New Zealander Charlie Tumahi, formerly lead singer of Australian bands Mississippi and Healing Force, would join on bass, bringing a consistent harmony vocal aspect to the band's work, which would become a huge part of its sound going forward. The band would start work on its second album, Futurama, which would be released in July of 1975 and feature the top 40 single Maid in Heaven. The album had a decidedly more mixed approach to genre than Axe Victim and set the stage for Nelson's approach to songwriting throughout the 70s. Although the album didn't reach American shores much due to the unavailability of UK releases in the US, New York Times music reviewer John Rockwell especially applauded Bill's guitar work on the album, saying that even though, quote, every month or is it week seems to bring a new rock band from Britain, eager to catch a few leftover crumbs from the Anglophilia of the 1960s. Most fail completely, others latch on to an FM cult success, a very few, unpredictably, make it big. He went on to say, Bebop Deluxe is redeemed by the brilliance of the band's playing, and particularly Nelson's guitar playing. His records put Nelson right up there with the other great masters of the electric guitar. Joining the band on the recording of Futurama was keyboardist Andrew Clark, who would then join the band permanently. This lineup would remain together as Bebop Deluxe for the next few years. The band's third release in February of '76, called Sunburst Finish, would contain the band's most successful single. Ships in the Night would peak at number 23 in the UK charts and propel the band in the crowded genre of the progressive rock movement that was the mid-70s in England. The album was also the first effort for legendary producer John Leckie, who would continue to work with Nelson for years and go on to work with acts such as Simple Minds, XTC, the Stone Roses, and Radiohead. What set Bebop Deluxe apart, however, was the ability of the band to approach the music with a more pop sensibility. But Nelson would continue to be frustrated by the record companies and music publications' efforts to put Bebop Deluxe into a genre, with the music rags even coining the new genre of art rock, into which Deluxe was often placed. Sunburst Finish would also become known for its placement of naked model Nikki Howarth Dweck on the cover, causing the obvious stir among record shops. Later that same year, in September of 1976, Bebop Deluxe would release its fourth album, Modern Music, which was written during their tour of America and featured what most consider to be Deluxe's peak of album making. It was their most successful album in the UK and was a slickly produced affair, awash with effects like flanger, phaser, and fuzz distortion, mildly following the concept of a futuristic landscape, with the title track focusing on the American tour. The songs also explored success while at the same time bucking many of the many conventions that the record companies were always trying to get Bill to conform to. The album was followed by Live in the Air Age, which summarized the prior Bebop Deluxe US tour. In the summer of 1977, Nelson and the band made a pilgrimage to the south of France to record their next album, which would become Drastic Plastic. Nelson was drawn to the town of Chateau Saint-Georges in Juan-le-Pen because of its relationship to Jean Cocteau. In the months following Deluxe's modern music album, the musical landscape had changed quite drastically, with the glam rock movement slowing down in lieu of the new wave movement. Pop music had become more synth-driven, and Nelson was inspired by the new sound, especially the albums of David Bowie's Berlin era. And so Drastic Plastic had a markedly different sound from the guitar-driven albums of Deluxe's past, with Andy Clark's keyboards coming to the fore. The album even featured some previews of Nelson's future work in ambient music. Nelson would later say that had he gotten his way, he would have disbanded Bebop Deluxe before the recording of Drastic Plastic, but he was convinced by Harvest Records to keep the project together. He said, quote, "Had I gotten my way, the Drastic Plastic material would have been recorded as the first Red Noise album. Instead, I adapted it for the final Bebop album." Drastic Plastic was to be the pivot point in Nelson's career, and like his decision to disband the earlier version of Bebop Deluxe after recording their first album, he would dismiss bassist Charlie Tamahi and drummer Simon Fox for his next project, keeping keys player Andy Clark and adding his brother Ian Nelson on sax and bassist Rick Ford. Red Noise would begin work on their only released studio album, Sound on Sound, in early 1979. Most Nelson fans see the album as a clear continuation of Drastic Plastic, but it divided Nelson's fans and critics, with the synth-driven sound being called artificial. Many fans of Nelson's guitar work were disappointed at the new direction as well. However, this was Bill's aim with the album, as he had started to feel constricted even by being known as only a guitarist. He wanted to explore new sounds and instruments, and wanted to branch out as a musician. Despite the album going to number 33 on the UK charts, backed by singles Furniture Music and Revolt into Style, EMI decided to drop Nelson after its release, as it was clear that they just didn't get Nelson's new musical direction. Nelson had given the label an ultimatum of either signing Red Noise or dropping him altogether. Bill was still reluctant about stepping out under his own name, as he saw even that as a pathway to constriction. Bill said that he formed Red Noise to avoid becoming trapped, and that whenever he wanted to change direction, he could just change the band name. EMI, however, didn't like this philosophy and didn't want to keep starting over with new projects that needed to be marketed, so EMI insisted that the album be marketed as Bill Nelson's Red Noise to promote continuity from Bebop Deluxe. Nelson looks back on Sound quite fondly, saying that the album was a more satisfying and freeing work than his previous efforts with Bebop Deluxe. The themes and musicality on the album sound complicated and very different from his past work, but Nelson claimed that the writing and recording of the album was actually the smoothest work he'd ever done. Exploring both mundane, household, everyday life in a dystopian Orwellian futurescape, Sound, though misunderstood in its time, was, of course, more accepted as a hidden gem of the late 70s and inspired such bands as Devo, who would take the mechanized, dystopian themes to the extreme. Nelson revealed some years later that he was working on a second Red Noise album in 1979, but that the songs remained on EMI's shelf for some time after the label had dropped him. The album had been largely recorded by Nelson himself, with some sax contributions from his brother Ian, and the label refused to market it without the usual five-piece band. So in 1972, EMI just wanted Nelson, and in 1978 they wanted a band. Make up your mind, EMI, but this is what would cause the inevitable split between Bill Nelson and the big labels permanently and set Bill on a path of musical freedom. Some of these efforts would appear on Nelson's first solo album called Quit Dreaming and Get on the Beam, which would be released under Nelson's new self-owned label called, of course, Cocteau Records. Nelson's manager Mark Rye would negotiate the sale of some of the songs from Harvest, after which the song Do You Dream in Color would get mild airplay and lead to the full Quit Dreaming album to be released. Along with this album, a bonus disc was released that featured some of Bill's earliest forays into ambient music, called Sounding the Ritual Echo, Atmospheres for Dreaming. Nelson would also start a fruitful career in producing around this time as well, starting with the Scottish band Skids, which contained Stuart Abramson, who would go on to form the band Big Country in a few years. Cocteau Records would become a strong independent label and garner the interest of many hungry young bands who were trying to get a foothold into pop superstardom. Aside from Nelson's own work, Cocteau would release singles by bands like Last Man in Europe, Fiat Lux, and A Flock of Seagulls. Bill himself, now freed from the shackles of big label shenanigans, released such ambitious projects as the 4 LP box set called Trial by Intimacy, The Book of Splendors, containing experimental electronic music. He also continued to explore ambient music, releasing several albums over the years. In 1983, Nelson was cited by new wave pioneer Gary Newman as his favorite guitar player bar none, and so Newman would ask Nelson to help produce his album Warriors. But as Nelson tells the story, Newman's and his visions for the album were very different, and Newman going in after the day's sessions to completely change in some respects what Nelson had done. As a result, Bill would request that his name be removed from the project. Nelson did say that years later, Newman told him that he looked back on it and he agreed with most of what Nelson had done. The rest of the 80s saw Nelson contribute music to the TV show Brond, several tracks on David Sylvian's Gone to Earth, and released the project's Chance Encounters in the Garden of Lights and Demonstrations of Affection. But even though Nelson could make what he wanted, he still needed labels to release and press the vinyl, and he started to have bad luck with his distribution later in the decade, with CBS Records' subsidiary Portrait and another label called Enigma going out of business. He would also divorce his first wife, suffer tax problems, go through another acrimonious split from his manager, Mark Rye, who had been selling bootleg versions of Nelson's albums and pocketing the royalties. That didn't stop Bill Nelson from rocking into the 90s, however, and his first release would be a 1992 album called Blue Moons and Laughing Guitars, which were simply home-recorded demos for a proposed 4-guitar, 2-drummer band that never materialized. Bill would later produce Roger Eno and Kate St. John's album The Familiar, which would lead to the trio releasing music as an ambient supergroup called Channel Light Vessel. In 1995, Nelson released an ambient album called Crimsworth, along with a second guitar-based instrumental album called Practically Wired, or How I Became Guitar Boy. This would be the first album that Nelson would release that focused on the guitar in over 15 years. The next year, Nelson released a more traditional album called After the Satellite Sings, which was credited by Bowie's then guitar player Reeves Gabrels as a major influence on his 1997 album Earthling. The 2000s saw a couple of interesting twists. Probably due to Nelson's overtly sci-fi themes in his songwriting, the first Nelsonica convention took place in 2001, and Nelson wasn't sure what to expect, but he'd had such a good time connecting with his fans that he resolved to make the convention every year for over a decade. This even culminated in a pair of new bands that played at the Nelsonica events. The first was an improvisational 3-piece band called Orchestra Futura, consisting of Nelson, Dave Sturt on bass, and Theo Travis on assorted woodwind and brass. The second band was the 7-piece Bill Nelson and the Gentlemen Rocketeers, with Nelson revisiting his bebop, red noise era and early solo work. Through the 2000s, Nelson would release around 4 albums worth of material per year, with the use of several small labels and financial backing from the successful UK music technology magazine Sound on Sound, with its name taken from Red Noise's album. And they would bankroll many of Nelson's home releases, as well as a small UK tour of Nelson and his band on a Bebop Deluxe and Beyond tour in 2004. He would continue to release both guitar and ambient releases throughout the decade. Now, as we close in on the present, Nelson seems to be all about his legacy, releasing many of his 2002 and onwards back catalog on Bandcamp and doing many interviews about the old days. Nelson has suffered a couple of debilitating health issues. He lost the hearing in his right ear in 2014 and has reported that due to his diabetes he started to have vision problems, and so his career of playing live seems to be over. But that hasn't stopped Bill from continuing to release albums. And in 2016, 46 years after its predecessor, Nelson would release the sequel to his debut solo album, New Northern Dream. In the end, Nelson's legacy can be hard to pin down. His work in the 70s and his brilliant technical playing style bridged the gap between progressive, independent sounds and pop sensibilities. But the artist turned his back on that life and decided to create a career that made music on his own terms, in his own way. As it is, you can't even really call Bill Nelson just a guitar player as much as you need to call him a multi-instrumentalist. But we here at the Guitar Historian channel feel very comfortable hanging the moniker of Fretmaster on him. He is truly an unsung master of the guitar solo. Here's hoping we continue to get music from Bill Nelson for a long time to come, but I'll let Bill himself, from an interview with Vintage Guitar Magazine, have the last word. In 2014, Bill said, "Personally, I can be a little ambivalent about Bebop Deluxe. Those few years in the 70s represent a fraction of my career, but because of the era and the more commercial nature of the music I recorded back then, the band has become the main signifier of my work. I've never stopped making music and never felt I've reached my goal, whatever that might be. I'm still looking to make an album which will satisfy me." For me, Bebop Deluxe was just a starting point in an ongoing adventure. I have fond memories from that time, but I don't feel particularly defined by it. Nevertheless, I'm more inclined to look at the world through a vehicle's front windshield rather than its rearview mirror. The future, I hope, will always be more magnetic than the past. Well, that's another episode of Forgotten Fretmasters. As always, please remember to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to let YouTube know that other guitar fans would like to see this video. Join our community here at the Guitar Historian, and please comment below with any personal stories that you have about Bill. Maybe you saw Bebop Deluxe way back in the 70s. We'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.